Thank you very much for having me. Thanks to Ariel for organising everything. Thanks to Barry. Thanks to Grania. I'm going to just crack on with this and we'll see what happens. So, where's my wee clicker? Okay. So of all the poets in the last half a century, Heaney is perhaps the one who's been written about most. And honest to God, there's not a lot left to say. I'm going to assume a certain level of familiarity with his work and not rehearse here his achievements or biography. I do want to think today about the ethical depth of some of his writing in relation to both the Troubles and Protestantism. And I want to speak as a Protestant who grew up, as it were, in his district, albeit as a Protestant nationalist with Irish parents. I want to trace some of Heaney's evolving thoughts about Protestantism through the early poems and how he negotiated that incipient political turmoil of those years. Heaney possessed innately the generous instinct, as Louis MacNeice says a poet should. And I want to look at how he decided to represent or simplify or complicate the relationships between the speakers of the poem, often seemingly himself, and the Protestant figures who appear or don't in the poems. As always in Northern Ireland, the poetic and the political intertwine. As you know, Heaney grew up in the Derry countryside, where interactions between Protestant and Catholics were more common and amicable than in the segregated cities. His first school, Anna Horish, had Protestant pupils as well as Catholic. As he says in Stepping Stones, my next door neighbour, Tommy Evans, for example, went there. Also the Booths, the Dixons, the Hewitts, the Kirkwoods, the Ellises, the Clarks, the Bowles. We'd all have been aware of the lines of division, although maybe I should say instead, aware of the difference. Division is probably a hindsighted exaggeration of what we felt at that stage. This wasn't urban ghetto life, but cheek by jowl, lane by field, country neighbour life. As he says, the pupils were aware of the division, and the poems in Death of a Naturalist, Heaney's debut from 1966, must be read in the light of that awareness. One of the first named characters we meet in that book is Dan Taggart of the early Purges. Hold on a wee sec. We're flying. Okay. The early Purges. So Taggart. So this is a poem. I'm not going to read every poem I put up, but I'll just read the lines that are relevant. So Taggart, for those paying attention, is a Scottish surname, and although names are an unreliable indicator of religion or politics, they are an indicator. In whatever you say nothing. From North, Heaney writes, Norman, Ken and Sydney signalled prod, and Seamus called me Sean with surefire pape. O land of password, hand grip, wink and nod of open minds as open as a trap. So Taggart is shortened from Mick Taggart, originating from the Gaelic Macan to Sagat, meaning son of the priest, indicating a connection to the clergy, particularly within the Scottish and Irish Protestant communities. So the early Purges opens, I was 6 when I first saw kittens drown. Dan Taggart pitched them, the scraggy wee shits, into a bucket, a frail metal sound, soft paws scraping like mad. The speaker's frightened by the corpses of the kittens slung in the dunghill, and that fear came back when Dan trapped big rats, snared rabbits, shot crows, or, with a sickening tug, pulled old hens' necks. Is it fair to read into the poem that Taggart, a Protestant, is teaching the speaker, who we read as a young Heaney, that life involves a certain unsentimental violence? There are other directly historical poems in the book about the violence done by the British in Ireland, the negligence and brutality of their response to the famine, for example. And it may be that the early Purges asks to be read in the light of that long past. Violence, the book suggests, is a phenomenon with a history. Later, in Death of a Naturalist, comes Docker, written in late 62, one of the earliest poems in the collection, and a piece which, aiming to show the subject's certitudes, also reveals the writer's own. In 4 four-line stanzas as tightly fastened as the cowling, plated forehead and sledge-head jaw of the titular figure, Heaney describes an identikit Protestant shipyard worker. The title is a mistake, as Heaney himself later acknowledged most dockers were Catholic. Heaney delineates a stereotype who's both domestic tyrant, tonight the wife and children will be quiet at slammed door and smokers cough, and violent sectarian, That fist would drop a hammer on a Catholic. Oh yes, that kind of thing could start again. Aside from the prescience, a few years later that kind of thing did start again. The poem is notable for its mischievous simile, when Heaney writes how the Protestant in the pub sits strong and blunt as a Celtic cross. There is an impish, ironic aspect to the likeness. It suggests not just the speaker's domain of reference, but also that the man has perhaps more in common with Celtic history and Catholicism than he's aware of. The simile, in effect, appropriates the man to being, in John Hewitt's phrase, of the Irishry. On the facing page to Docker, in a kind of call and response, is a poem, Per Woman in a City Church, which also seems like a direct rejoinder to Louis MacNeice's assertion in his poem Carrickfergus that he was the rector's son, born to the Anglican order, banned forever from the candles of the Irish pur. And Heaney himself mentions that MacNeice, whose work he admired but which he felt kept him at a reader's distance, as opposed to Kavanagh and Hughes, was, as he said himself, banned forever from the candles of the Irish pur, which was not a ban I suffered from. And the poem seems to be a deliberate attempt to claim that imaginative territory, perhaps too much. Aside from the word pur, which echoes MacNeice, the candles themselves overwhelm the poem. It opens, the small wax candles melt to light, flicker in marble, reflect bright asterisks on brass candlesticks. At the Virgin's altar on the right, blue flames are jerking on wicks. The second stanza returns to the cold yellow candle tongues and blue flame, and the third and last stanza finds Heaney personifying the shawlies, women who tended to work in the linen mills and wore shawls as both coat and hat. The shawlies themselves as embodying the candles. In the gloom, you cannot trace a wrinkle on their beeswax brows. Though technically adroit, these are a young man's poems and don't attempt to complicate the received ideas. Just as Docker traffics in Protestant stereotypes, so Per Woman in a City Church is at arm's length from its subject matter and doesn't go far beyond recording, almost photographing, the old dough-faced woman with black shawls. The poem that is often thought of being Heaney's poem about Protestants is from the 1972 collection Wintering Out, Heaney's third. The other side is both about the other side of the house, as they say in Ulster, and tells the other side of the story from the Protestant poet John Hewitt's poem, The Hill Farm. I don't know if you know John Hewitt. He's often thought of as the grandfather of Northern Irish poetry or poetry from the north of Ireland. He wrote famously, I'm an Ulsterman of planter stock. I was born in the island of Ireland, so secondarily, I'm an Irishman. I was born in the British archipelago, and English is my native tongue, so I am British. British archipelago consists of offshore islands to the continent of Europe, so I'm European. This is my hierarchy of values, and so far as I'm concerned, anyone who admits one step in that sequence of values is falsifying the situation. Heaney sometimes comes close to taking that position, though, as he writes, as the circumstances became more virulent and politicized in the 1970s, the need to establish new stays against confusion became more urgent. And though he himself once had a British passport, indeed, Heaney once worked in the British Passport Office in London, he felt he had to renounce the complications and identify solely as Irish. He wrote famously, my passport's green, no glass of ours was ever raised to toast the Queen, in his poem demurring at being included in an anthology of British verse. Let's look at the Hewitt poem, The Hill Farm. My errand brought me once again down the steep road, down the lane, along the steep road, down the lane, and through the long and stumbling dark. There was no cry, no welcome bark announced my hearing. All was still from lamp in glen to star on hill. The door was shut, but curtained light thrust muffled challenge to the night. Then at the porch I stopped and stood to muster courage to intrude, for as I paused I overheard the rise and fall of rhythmic word. A voice, the mother's, giving clear the rosary, the evening prayer, and, mumbling on a lower key, the voices of the family responding and repeating, each with adult or with childish speech, the invocations running on with, now and then, a smothered yawn. At each Hail Mary, full of grace, I pictured every friendly face clenched in devotion of a kind alien to my breed and mind, easy as breathing, natural as birds that fly, as leaves that fall. yet with a sense that I still stood far from that faith-based certitude here in the vast enclosing night, outside its little ring of light. As often in Hewitt, at least for this reader, the poem explains too much. Too much is overdetermined, and the technique is a touch rickety. The rhyming couplets and the strict iambic tetrameters are a little trite and forced in places. The occasional contraction he indulges in to iterate the rhythm comes over a little unnaturally. All was still from lamp and glen to star on hill. The diction in places clashes against itself. When he writes, for example, I pictured every friendly face clenched in devotion. I find it hard to reconcile friendly with clenched. The speaker's thoughts are also full of assumptions that might give the reader pause. Why does he imagine Catholicism, in that oxymoronic phrase, a faith-based certitude, to be easy as breathing, natural as birds that fly, as leaves that fall? Standing behind this assumption seems to be an unquestioned trope that Catholicism is somehow closer to the earth, to an animalistic way of being, and not as capable of being racked with doubts or intellectual questions. And for all its features, the poem lacks specificity and the trappings of reality. It deals in unfeatured archetypes, the family, the mother, the errand. There are no names, no details, no weather, no topography beyond the steep road and glen. I respond to the piece's psychogeography more than its attempts at national allegory. The physical and metaphysical walk through the long and stumbling dark to come upon an exclusionary ring of light in the vast enclosing night. It has something of Frost's desert places. They cannot scare me with the empty spaces between the stars, on stars where no human race is. The bathos in that smothered yawn is not ineffective and is a moment when reality pokes its head above the parabolic. In locating the poem at a hill farm, Hewitt is noting to the fact that during the plantations in the 16th and 17th century in Ulster, the native population were dispossessed of the good, fertile lowlands and forced into the higher grounds to farm the poorer soils. Heaney's response, The Other Side, also alludes to this. It's a triptych portraying a neighbour of the speakers who comes to visit the family, comes to visit while the family is saying the rosary. The Protestant neighbour is rude, patriarchal, dismissive, referring to the speaker's land as being as poor as Lazarus. In the plantations, Londonderry, County Londonderry, or County Derry, was unusual compared to the other counties, as the City of London was invited in May 1609 to undertake the plantation of the whole area, and 12 London companies, presided over by the Irish Society, undertook the plantation and were allotted portions. This is from Braidwood's Ulster Dialects. Braidwood was Heaney's lecturer at Queen's, and he's taken it from Moody's 1930 history of the plantation of Derry. Briefly, and because I love a list, I just want to read out the companies were located as follows. The Goldsmiths, southeast of Londonderry itself. The Grocers at Muff. The Fishmongers at Ballykelly. The Merchant Tailors at McCosquin. The Haberdashers at Artichelly. The cloth workers at Articlave, the skinners at Dungiven, the vintners at Balaki, the salters at Macrafelt, the ironmongers at Agadui and Agivy, the mercers at Mavanaha, and the drapers at Moneymore. The only other important grantee in Derry was the company's arch enemy, Sir Thomas Phillips, who was granted a large estate of 3,000 Irish acres at Limavady and a small one of 500 acres at Toome. This brings us to Heaney's father's farm. Heaney's father's land consisted of 2 small farms he had inherited. And all in all, as Heaney says in Stepping Stones, I think the land amounted to something like 40 acres. By no means a big farm, but bigger by 10 or 15 acres, I'd say, than the others around us. And Heaney is expansive in Stepping Stones when Dennis O'Driscoll asks him whether there was any hint of class distinction between the people with larger and smaller holdings, between Catholics and Protestants for that matter, explaining, we were at eye level socially with most neighbours, and in fact, in that part of the country, I'm speaking very particularly, the Protestant neighbours weren't really all that well off. Willie Evans, over the road from us, was a labouring man and had no land. Sandy and Rachel Evans had a bungalow-type house with roses and a certain style, but owned no more than a couple of fields. The Gilmores and Dawsons, further up the main road, had no land to mention, but we were on very good terms with all of these people, respectable neighbours, all part of something settled. The Garvins, for example, would have been more or less the same kind of family as we were in terms of the size of the farm, the non-sectarian disposition of the household, and a general unanxiousness about where they stood. And then there were those two other Evans men I mentioned here and there in the poems, George and Alan, very easy in their way of going on, very friendly. They had been in the army during the war and brought my father a big set of rosary beads from Rome after they were demobbed. The remark about having having stolen the beads off the Pope's dresser was much quoted. And you remember in Midterm Break, the poem about his wee brother Christopher dying. It's his father and Big Jim Evans he meets in the porch. Big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. So whatever the reality of Heaney's own circumstances, the other side aims for a more representative political truth for the whole of the country, and is speaking back, it seems, to Hewitt. It opens, "Thigh deep in sedge and marigolds, a neighbour laid his shadow on the stream, vouching, it's poor as Lazarus, that ground, and brushed away among the shaken leafage. I lay where his lee sloped to meet our fallow, nested on moss and rushes, my ear swallowing his fabulous biblical dismissal, that tongue of chosen people. The neighbour is portrayed as contemptuous, brusque, and mildly threatening. The epithet of shaken seems to apply to the speaker as much as the leafage. The neighbour seems to stray from Kavanagh's poem The Twelfth, dated 12th of July, 1943. Let me just check if I put that on. Aye. So this is a poem by Kavanagh with that date, 12th of July, 1943, which is obviously the big parade day for Protestants in Ulster, not just in Northern Ireland, but in Monaghan and Donegal. Kavanagh, who's from Monaghan in the Republic of Ireland, which is part of Ulster, but in the Republic, writes of the 12th of July, the voice of Ulster speaking, tart as weak old buttermilk from a churn, surprising the tired palates of the South. I said to myself, from these we have much to learn, hard business talk, no medieval babble, but the sudden knife of reality running to the heart with experience. Kavanagh admires this firm cast of the Ulster men he sees and sees no threat in them in the 1940s, coming as he does from another country. He talks of the biblical farmers from Rich Hill or Coleraine and all that was sharp, precise and pungent flavoured, finally heralding the young men out of Ulster who will dare to drive a wedge in Dublin's lounge bar Panzers. With the mention of the Panzers, the last word in the poem, which refers to the German tanks in World War II, Kavanagh draws a distinction between the Irishmen who fought and died against Hitler and those in Dublin who hung out in lounge bars drinking, since, of course, the Republic of Ireland was neutral in the war, or as the Irish call it, the emergency. And indeed, infamously, when news came through on the 2nd of May, 1945, that Hitler was dead, De Valera called on the Third Reich's minister to Ireland, Edward Hempel, to offer condolences on his death. Anyway, the neighbour in Heaney's The Other Side is one of Kavanagh's biblical farmers. Heaney identifies them as old Johnny Junkin in Stepping Stones. The Junkins are one of 3 Protestant families whose farms marched, that is, boarded the Wood Farm, another Heaney family farm they'd moved to from Mossbourne in 1954 when Heaney was away at St. Columns at school. Wood Farm is where The Other Side is set, and Heaney goes on in part 1 to repeat the scene. When he would stand like that on the other side, white-haired, swinging his blackthorn at the marsh weeds, he prophesied above our scraggy acres, then turned away towards his promised furrows on the hill, a wake of pollen drifting to our bank, next season's tares. The neighbour's land, though on a hill, is portrayed as the promised land, contrasted with the scraggy acres, just as the speaker depicts the neighbour considering himself as one of the chosen people. Something interesting happens with that unusual word, tares, Heaney uses. For all the religious allusions ascribed to the neighbour, the speaker's use of the word tares suggests the speaker himself with a familiarity with the Bible. Tares, as you might or might not know, means weed, specifically a weed resembling corn when young, and the word is only familiar, at least to me, from the Bible. The most well-known use of it is in Matthew 13, verses 24 to 30. In the King James Version it reads, "Another parable he put forth to them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? He said to them, An enemy has done this. The servant said to him, "Do you want us then to go and gather them up?" But he said, "No, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn." So the implication in the use of that word to end the first section is that the neighbour whose pollen drifts to the speaker's bank is an enemy sowing weeds in their land. It's a subtle way of upping the level of antagonism. Part 2 begins. For days we would rehearse each patriarchal dictum. It's just that iambic beat that Heaney does so well. Anyway, for days we would rehearse each patriarchal dictum. Lazarus, the Pharaoh, Solomon, and David and Goliath rolled magnificently like loads of hay too big for our small lanes, or faltered on a rut. Your side of the house, I believe, hardly ruled by the book at all. His brain was a whitewashed kitchen, hung with texts, swept tidy as the body of the kirk. Kirk is the Scottish word for church, and again is meant to suggest the neighbour's Scottish Protestant heritage. The only colours in the poem are black and white. White head, black thorn, his brain like a whitewashed kitchen hung with texts, as if everything is black and white in this world. I also hear in whitewashed something of the idea of erasure, of cover-up, of whitewashing reality. The most common description of the Widgery inquiry into Bloody Sunday is the Civil Rights March in Derry, at which the British Army shot dead 13 men. A 14th later died in hospital, and which happened on the 30th of January 1972. The same year Wintering Out was published, that the collection The Other Side appears in, was that it was a whitewash. The Widgery was announced by Ted Heath the day after the killings, and in less than a month, the Widgery inquiry had fully exonerated the soldiers and wrongly claimed that many of the dead had been armed. After all these dismissive insults, your side of the house, I believe, etc., suggest Catholics don't follow the true teachings of the Bible. Part 3 opens. And this is, you can see what he does in the first two parts, and then the third part, I think, is just like, only Heaney could have done this bit. Then sometimes when the rosary was dragging mournfully on in the kitchen, we would hear his step round the gable, though not until after the litany would the knock come to the door and the casual whistle strike up on the doorstep. A right-looking night, you might say. I was dandering by and says, I might as well call. But now I stand behind him in the dark yard, in the moan of prayers. He puts a hand in his pocket or taps a little tune with the blackthorn shyly, as if he were party to lovemaking or a stranger's weeping. Should I slip away, I wonder, or go up and touch his shoulder and talk about the weather or the price of grass seed? This dark yard is both a real place and a metaphorical space, echoing the vast enclosed night that Hewitt references. It's also contemporaneous in some sense. The times are dark. And it's also, thirdly, a place of the speaker's and the poet's imagination. The question posed here is more philosophical than actual. Why would the speaker slip away from his own house? What is actually being posed is what is the correct response to the Protestant's intrusion? What is right action, as the Buddhists say? In the circumstances of Northern Ireland at this time, what is the proper Catholic response to Protestant prejudice and provocations? The options are to slip away, to emigrate, or to engage in physical contact, to touch his shoulder. And is there a suggestion of direct action there? Or engage in dialogue, either something inconsequential, here framed as the weather, or to talk about the price of grass seed? And with grass seed, and all farmers discuss that, reminding me of the truth again of Pound's dictum, the natural object is always the adequate symbol. With the grass seed, Heaney appears to be suggesting the neighbours, the two sides, talk about what growth and change would entail and would cost. The other side writes itself into a shared literary canon, and by finding symbols adequate to our predicament, succeeds in framing in microcosm some of the most pressing questions for Catholics in the early 70s in the North. It manages to capture the real sound of speech and says, I might as well call. And to read in its details and phrasing as both realistic and emblematic, it is full of, in Blake's phrase, the holiness of minute particulars. Wintry Night features other poems that deal with politics through allegory. Heaney describes the servant boy in the poem of the same name as old work whore, slave blood, who comes to the back doors of the little barons. Oh. You haven't got that. Interestingly, Heaney revealed in Stepping Stones that the figure of the servant boy was based on a family friend called Ned Thompson, which suggests he was almost certainly a Protestant, though Heaney doesn't specifically confirm this. He says he was a small, stooped ancient with a drooped moustache, a bit like a down-at-heel Thomas Hardy. The house he lived in had a clay floor and clay walls, a 19th century cabin if ever there was one, and from him I did hear talk about different masters, about sleeping in the loft, about the ones who fed him well and the ones who didn't, about having to walk for miles home and back on a Sunday and all that. He was at home in our kitchen, but he also belonged to the world of folk songs like The Rocks of Bawn and Macrafelt, Mayfair. Instead of giving the Thompson figure a class consciousness, though, Heaney appropriates and repurposes the experiences of the Protestant as a Catholic for the aims of the poem, much as he likens the Protestant shipyard worker to a Celtic cross. He says, the servant boy in the poem, however, is also meant as a portrait of a minority consciousness, a minority artist's consciousness even. Carrying the warm eggs is what a servant would have to do in the morning, check the nests and bring in what the laying hens had laid. But it's also an emblem of the human call to be more than just resentful and impenitent. Even while justices are being endured in the poem, the servant boy kept his patience and his counsel while he was wintering out. Whatever he said nothing. He knew the score, bore the brunt, and bided his time. But by the time of the civil rights marches, his stoop had begun to be straightened, and his walk, I would like to think, was being braced by the poem in which he appeared. Is there a latent difficulty in having to write types, with having to create versions that represent more than an individual or the actual? There is the danger of retreating into slightly cartoonish versions of others, the reductive but seductive depictions in Docker or of the Shawleys. Nationalism demands we demarcate ourselves in groups. Religion does likewise. Northern Ireland has an overdose of both those sicknesses. Heaney, of course, was aware of the complications. He himself wrote a radio play about the executed Protestant leader of the United Irishmen, Harry Monroe, whose father was Presbyterian and mother Church of Ireland, and is often eclipsed by the more famous and also Protestant Henry Joy McCracken. Poetry, contrary to politics, tends to celebrate the individual. It allows uniqueness, often it demands it. The creative effort itself is a process of challenging embedded narratives of belief in order to think the world freshly into being for oneself. But the prejudices and infringements on Catholics in Northern Ireland meant that in order to make political poems that spoke to the Catholic condition, Heaney often had to streamline complex and even nourishing relationships with Protestant neighbours and friends, such as in The Other Side or Servant Boy. The condition of modernity is existential. We are all thrown onto the world alone. The modern European sensibility, so often associated with, say, Beckett and the Irish or Kafka and the Jews, can be viewed as the spear tip of the still unfolding affective situations of our own era. The Troubles necessitated a step away from the individual towards the tribe. It was a tribal situation. And Heaney's poetry constantly weighs the question, as he writes at the end of Exposure, the last poem in North, as I sit weighing and weighing my responsible Tristia. The Tristia is a collection of poems following Ovid's banishment from Rome. To what extent does a poet speak on behalf of or to the tribe? O'Driscoll asks him in Stepping Stones, you said in your Place and Displacement lecture that your generation of writers felt it was not necessary to deal directly with political issues because the subtleties and tolerances of their art were precisely what they had to contribute to the coarseness and intolerances of public life. Looking back, would you say this approach continued to sustain you and the Ulster poets through the Troubles? Heaney's answer is instructive. All of us, Protestant poets, Catholic poets, and don't those terms fairly put the wind up you? All of us probably had some good notion that a good poem was a paradigm of good politics, a site of energy and tension and possibility, a truth-telling arena but not a killing field. Against that, Heaney was wary of being overly placatory, A minister of community relations praised Heaney's work, saying, as Heaney recounts, that much of my work was immediately accessible to everybody in Northern Ireland, whatever their religious or political affinities. So naturally, he went on to observe how this proved how much common ground we shared and so on. Perfectly harmless, decent speak on the part of a minister. But it rang a warning bell in me. I wasn't discommoded by English critics gabbling on about the out-of-dateness of bulls and bogs, but I was caught in the hop when I found those images being read as some kind of endorsement of the northern status quo. I began to see what the political spin could be, so from that came a new readiness to print something like whatever you say nothing, and later on to have a go at a sequence like Singing School. Heaney sums up Wintering Out thus: the more I talk about those poems, the more I see they were about the need to break out of the consensus that Ulster was a good wee place, the need to get on the road to Aarhus, to acknowledge the lostness and unhappiness of home. Which brings us to North in 1975, which celebrates its 50th anniversary this year and is going to be reprinted by Faber in a special edition. North built on the promise of the astounding poem Bogland, which ends Door into the Dark. And that poem does many things, but also, as Heaney puts it, it posits an implied alternative to the British connection by making the Bog of Allen the mythic centre. Much ink has been spilled over these seminal poems, and its reception in the North was complicated, with Kieran Carson, my predecessor at the Heaney Centre and as the Heaney Professor, with his review in the Honest Ulsterman accusing Heaney infamously of being the laureate of violence. The lines that have attracted most discussion come at the end of the poem Punishment. He writes, I who have stood dumb with your betraying sisters, called and tar, wept by the railings, who would connive in civilized outrage, yet understand the exact and tribal intimate revenge. Carson's response is, being killed for adultery is one thing, being tarred and feathered is another. Heaney seems to be offering his understanding of the situation almost as a consolation. It is as if he is saying, suffering like this is natural. These things have always happened. They happened then, they happen now, and that is sufficient ground for understanding and absolution. It is as if there never were and never will be any political consequences of such acts. They have been removed to the realm of sex, death, and inevitability. I don't propose to rehearse the arguments about North here, but I'd note that Heaney's own nationalism had clearly evolved in line with his own move from the North to the South. As he said, he moved from Belfast in 72 down to Glanmore and Wicklow. As he said in 1975, I always thought of the political problem, maybe because I'm not really a political thinker, as being an internal Northern Ireland division. I thought along sectarian lines. Now I think that the genuine political confrontation is between Ireland and Britain. I'd also note that Heaney seems in two minds about some of the bog poems himself. On the one hand, defending and sure of his artistic decisions, as in a 1977 interview with Seamus Heaney, who was Barry's predecessor here, where he explains that the poems in North arose out of a necessity to shape and give palpable linguistic form to the urgency he felt regarding Northern Ireland's political complexity in the 1970s. But by 2002, Heaney appears to pull himself back somewhat, explaining that I felt carried away by the material, into and out of the material, and probably made a mistake in trying to tame the strangeness of it all. I explicated the poems too trimly in relation to the politics and dangers on the ground at the time. I should probably just have let them abide there in their own exhumed oddity. I haven't time or space here to look at all the later poems, but I wanted to briefly examine the various ways Heaney dealt with the sectarian killing of his own cousin, Colm McCartney. McCartney was from Balahi, and he's one of two Catholics shot in the head by the UVF in South Armagh as they travelled back from the Derry versus Dublin All-Ireland semi-final GAA match at Croke Park in Dublin. They were ordered to stop by a group of men in military uniforms who were manning a checkpoint. According to Lost Lives, which is a big seminal book of all the people who died in the Troubles, 3,500, an unmarked police car drove through the checkpoint earlier and reported it to the army, but apparently no action was taken. Heaney had written an elegy for him, The Strand at Loch Beg, in which he sets himself and Colm as two who fight shy, who could not crack the whip or seize the day, portraying them not as men of action, but big-voiced scullions, herders, talkers and buyers. And so we'll just read the end of that poem. And he says, across that strand of ours, the cattle graze up to their bellies in an early mist, and now they turn their unbewildered gaze to where we work our way through squeaking sedge, drowning in dew. Like a dull blade with its edge honed bright, lock-beg half shines under the haze. I turn because the sweeping of your feet has stopped behind me, to find you on your knees with blood and roadside muck in your hair and eyes, then kneel in front of you in brimming grass and gather up cold handfuls of the dew to wash you, cousin. I dab you clean with moss, fine as the drizzle out of a low cloud. I lift you under the arms and lay you flat, with rushes that shoot green again. I plait green scapulars to wear over your shroud. So in Station Island, the ghost of Colm McCartney, then he encounters him, several years later down the writing life. And Colm McCartney tells Heaney that let's read the extract. You saw that and you wrote that, not the fact. You confused evasion and artistic tact. The Protestant who shot me through the head, I accused directly, but indirectly you, who now atone perhaps upon this bed for the way you whitewashed ugliness and drew the lovely blinds of the Purgatorio and saccharined my death with morning dew. When Heaney meets the shade of his cousin in Station Island, it's notable that Heaney has the dead man say, the Protestant who shot me through the head I accused directly. Not loyalist, not terrorist, the Protestant. McCartney had been killed because of his Catholicism, and perhaps because of this, the religion of the killer is, the poem suggests, the most salient aspect. In Whitewash, again, I hear yet again another echo of the Widgery inquiry. There's also that iambic pentametrical force of the Protestant who shot me through the head. The prot picked up by shot, and that triple internal rhyme of who, you, through, and all in natural conversational language, what Miwash calls plain speech in the mother tongue. This is one of Heaney's signature traits, I think, and can be perhaps traced to the internal sonic play of poetry in Irish, which tends to assonance but not rhyme. Heaney has so many lines that use a triple assonance but keep the vigour and naturalness of ordinary speech. One of the poems he says, once and once only I fired a gun. My foul mouth takes it out on you. In any event, the sonic rectitude of the line under discussion is difficult to resist. McCartney had been killed apparently in a revenge attack for the killing of William Meeklin, a local Protestant mobile shop owner and former RUZ reservist, kidnapped and tortured by the IRA a week earlier. There is something thrilling in the naming of the murderer as a Protestant, something unsheathed and hard-edged and direct, as there is meant to be. Heaney was under intense pressure to speak on behalf of Catholics first, and then, after he'd moved south, to speak on behalf of Ireland, much as Yeats had taken on the mantle of national poet. In The Flight Path, which is a poem in the spirit level from 1996, Heaney tells the story of Danny Morrison, who was the IRA's director of publicity, meeting him on a train as he's coming in from the airport. So he enters and sits down opposite and goes for me head on. When, for fuck's sake, are you going to write something for us? If I do write something, whatever it is, I'll be writing for myself. And that was that, or words to that effect. In Stepping Stones, Heaney expanded on the meeting. The account of what went on in the train as it happened is as it happened, yes. I make the speaker a bit more aggressive than he was at the time, but the presumption of entitlement on his part, which was the main and amazing aspect of that meeting, is rendered faithfully. It was all done pretty discreetly, actually. My interlocutor was the Sinn Féin spokesman, Danny Morrison, whom I didn't particularly know at the time. He came down from his place in the carriage and sat into the seat in front of me for maybe 8 or 10 minutes. I didn't feel menaced. It was a straightforward face-to-face test of will or steadiness. I simply rebelled at being commanded. If anybody was going to pull rank, it wasn't going to be a party spokesman. This was in pre-hunger strike times during the dirty protest by Republican prisoners in the H-blocks. The whole business was weighing on me greatly already, and I had toyed with the idea of dedicating the Ugolino translation, his version of an episode in Dante's Inferno, to the prisoners. But our friend's intervention put paid to any such gesture. After that, I wouldn't give and wasn't so much free to refuse as unfree to accept. So as Barry mentioned, I teach at the Heaney Centre in Belfast, and in Northern Ireland, much of the rewriting of history going on at the moment is from Sinn Féin explaining there was no option to IRA violence, and it's simply untrue. Indeed, it's important to remember that by the mid-70s, a series of reforms ensured that the non-partisan Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association's original aims would largely have been achieved. The 1971 Housing Executive Act dealt with discrimination in the allocation of housing. The 1971 Local Government Act provided a commissioner to deal with boundaries for district councils to stop gerrymandering. The Fair Employment Act of 1976 set up an agency to promote equality and opportunity for unemployment and eliminate unlawful discrimination on the grounds of religion or politics. Despite all that, Northern Ireland had stumbled into the morass of the Troubles where it would be stuck for decades. In the week I was writing this, the Omagh inquiry, which is the next town over to where I'm from in Keough-Naughton, in Tyrone, the Omagh inquiry is ongoing into the bombing by the rail IRA that killed 29 people in 1998. And details of the deaths of the victims are extremely upsetting. Again, it's the holiness of minute particulars. Fintan O'Toole, who is Heaney's official biographer, has written an excellent piece in the Irish Times about the inquiry. After discussing those holy particulars of several victims' deaths, there's one 8-year-old called Oran Doherty who was eating a whole cooked chicken he'd just bought. The piece ends, "Such specifics make each victim unique, yet Omagh itself was not. The horror was not so different on Bloody Friday or in Dublin, Monaghan, Enniskillen, Birmingham, Claudy, Le Mans, Guildford, but it is all now processed into songs and chants, served up as recreational patriotism, safely distanced in the indifference of 'that was a long time ago,' or the insouciance of 'there was no alternative.' We should not need to be hit by this shrapnel of exploded lives to know that it wasn't and there was." So the Good Friday Agreement of 1994, as the great Seamus Mallon memorably said, was Sunningdale for slow learners. Sunningdale was the 73 agreement that the Ulster workers' strike took down. So we had 20 extra years of murder and mayhem because of the inability of leaders to agree and end the violence. And I'd like to finish with just one personal anecdote that illustrates again how Heaney picked a neat way through the pressures of those years. I was arranging to meet up with Seamus the month he died, and I sent him a message saying I was in Cookstown, where I'm from, as I said, just off now to the Sinn Féin office on the Burn Road. I was writing a piece on Mid-Ulster for the New York Review. I'm trying to interview different politicians, and I'd hoped to speak to Francie Malloy, who'd taken over as my local MP from Martin McGuinness, who was the leader of the IRA. In the event, Malloy didn't turn up, and I just sat there for 3 hours. But Seamus replied, and this was just less than 2 weeks before he died, and he mentioned that the one time I was in a Sinn Féin office was when Danny Morrison was asking me to write an introduction to Bobby Sands' poems. Bobby Sands, as you know, was the hunger striker. I said I could do it if the poems were published by a regular commercial publisher, since that would allow people other than Republicans to respond. But Anne Poblack said no. So as a Mid-Ulster Protestant who grew up in the Troubles, Heaney's finely tuned sense of the complexities was welcome. He understood, as he said in Stepping Stones, that when the hunger striker Francis Hughes died, that he was a neighbour's child, yes, but he was also a hitman, and his Protestant neighbours would have considered him involved in something like a war of genocide against them rather than a war of liberation against the occupying forces of the Crown. At that stage, the IRA's self-image as liberators didn't work much magic with me, but neither did the too brutal simplicity of Margaret Thatcher's "a crime is a crime is a crime, it is not political." My own mantra in those days was the remark by Miwash that I quote in Away From It All. I was stretched between contemplation of a motionless point and the command to participate actively in history. Indeed, Hughes was an IRA legend, but he also murdered reputedly more than a dozen people, including a 10-year-old girl. Heaney refused to toe the Republican line, even in the face of provocations from both sides. His poetry offered a space for second thoughts beyond the knee-jerk reactions of the headlines and the received narratives of church and state and school. His poetry was not a space to grind political axes, but an attempt to enter into the other side's point of view to encounter plurality. Heaney managed to adhere to his nationalism, but also exist in a place of doubt and ambiguity. In a letter to Brendan Hamill in 1973, who demanded to know why he didn't take a definitive political stand, Heaney replied that he was involved with uncertainties. Which reminds me of Keats' prescription of negative capabilities, and that movement from the certitudes, the faith-based certitudes, to uncertainties. From the certitudes of Docker and the faith-based certitudes of Hewitt's Hill Farm to being involved in uncertainties. So Keats wrote, I'm sure you know this quote, is so well known, but it seemed to apply to Heaney, at least as far as I'm concerned. What quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously? I mean negative capability. That is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts. And part of Heaney's greatness for me is exactly that capacity. Thanks very much, folks.